Thank you. It's an honor to be invited to speak at this event, to get outside of the ivory tower, so to speak, and to talk about an issue that I think is on the minds of a lot of people on the left. I think it's a complicated issue, and let me just say at the outset a few things about how I came to be part of this delegation. There are Kurdish women in Rojava in some of their traditional dress, and I was dressed in my traditional California dress where I come from. So,
can anyone hear? Can anyone hear? I'm just feeling just speak up.
Okay, I can speak up. Don't worry about that. Okay. Anyhow, but let me just say at the outset, I'm trained as a political scientist, and now in a sociology department. So this is the first time I've been speaking to an anthropology group. But I agree that the social sciences are one. So it's also an honor to be speaking to a group of anthropologists or people interested in anthropology. As a political scientist, what I've written mostly on are nationalist movements. And in particular, I'm an expert on nationalist movements in Spain. I wrote my dissertation on language politics and secessionism in Catalonia and the Basque Country. I've written on as well. And that's actually how I first became familiarized with the Kurdish question. I was invited to Diyarbakir in 2007 to be part of a delegation speaking about the lessons from Spain of the peace process with ETA, which was underway at the time, for an audience in the south of Turkey that was interested in channeling a peace process with Kurdish, the Kurdish movement, in particular the PKK and Abdullah Öcalan, who has been in prison since 1998. So that was my first experience, and then my second experience is through my post at Cambridge, where I'm very interested in the question of self-determination and struggles for self-determination in the 21st century in a more comparative vein. So I've been taking advantage of the opportunities of great graduate students from all over the world to search for graduate students who are interested in doing monographs on different nationalist movements. And Dilar Diritz, who's one of my students, is very interested in the role of the women in the Kurdish movement. So I took on my role of supervising her, and from there she's very active in the Kurdish diaspora, and she was involved in organizing an academic delegation to go see what was going on in Rojava and to do some publication for what was seen to be, some public relations for what was seen to be a revolution that everyone had come into, in particular last year, come into the public consciousness in the West, so to speak, through this struggle in Kobane, and people in the mainstream media had a very clear understanding of who these people were fighting against, the forces of evil and darkness and the like of ISIS as portrayed in the media. But what they were fighting for, I think, is something that is much less understood, at least in mainstream, people following the mainstream press. But because I'm not an expert on the region, I'm not an expert. I don't speak the languages of the region, and I was taken on an academic delegation that was there for 10 days, and we were hosted by the revolutionary government in Rojava. So I kind of see my experience there as a kind of like an embedded academic, so to speak. You know, the journalists do their embedded journalism with the American troops or with the British troops. It's a similar kind of experience. So I'm not sure that I can speak directly to what's happening in Rojava, but I can speak about things that were obvious to me, that were interesting, both in terms of things that seemed obviously admirable and inspiring about the revolution, but also the problems and the dilemmas of the revolution. So I'm of two minds about the revolution. In particular, I see many strengths, but I also see many challenges. And I think that one of the dangers for us on the left is to get involved in a kind of take it like your team, where I'm pro Rojava revolution, so I won't listen to any criticism of it, or I'm opposed to the Rojava revolution, so I'm going to dismiss any admiration for it. So I want to sort of bring an open mind and think through some of the problems, which I think are problems that are particular to Rojava, but they're also problems that are inherent in any revolutionary situation. So I want to talk about those dilemmas and how they're playing themselves out on the ground. So just at the outset, who are the Kurds? Is a really important issue because it's not. This is a region that is contested militarily. And so if we look at it, in order to understand what's happening in Rojava, we have to understand the broader context, and that broader context, I believe, is framed by the criminal invasion of Iraq that created a crisis to the states in the Middle East more generally, and a kind of collapse of state authority in which you have a dialectic between the collapse in Iraq and the collapse in Syria, the emergence of ISIS, and at the same time you have the emergence of this revolutionary situation, these revolutionary opportunities up in the northeast of Syria, which is the region called Rojava, which means west in Kurdish, so it's west, imagined as West Kurdistan. But let me just say something about this at the outset, which is that this is, of course, a contentious question. What we call it, even calling Rojava. Speaking at the SOAS, I was pushed on this issue why I was not being explicit enough about it being the west of the Greater Kurdistan, and the Kurds themselves are, of course, divided over multiple kinds of projects, which are associated also with obviously the project of the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, which is very closely aligned with the United States, and the alliances, the developing alliances between the revolutionary forces in Rojava and the NATO forces is something that is a particularly polemical and contentious element. But just before we get to all of that, let's just talk about the contentiousness with respect to the question of who the subject of the revolution is. So this is a Kurdish revolution, and and this is the Kurdish movement is again a subject of much debate and contention. So who are the Kurds? For example, according to the Encyclopedia Britannica, Kurdistan covers about 190,000 square kilometers in this region, covering Turkey, part of Syria, part of Turkey, a part of Iraq, and part of Iran. But however, according to the Encyclopedia of Islam, Kurdistan covers around 190,000 square kilometers alone in Turkey, plus another 125,000 square kilometers in Iran, another 65,000 square kilometers in Iraq, another 12,000 square kilometers in Syria, with a total area of approximately 392,000 square kilometers. So this is a territory which is contested exactly how much of the territory exists, and of course, for a long time, the goal of the cadre of the organizations in which most of the revolutionary cadres were initiated into political activism, paramilitary action, and the like, were struggling for the realization of a greater Kurdistan. And so this question of the goal of a greater Kurdistan, and in particular the renunciation of that goal, at least the explicit renunciation of that goal by Abdullah Öcalan and by the forces, the revolutionary forces that are aligned with Öcalan, is a matter which remains contentious because people don't believe that actually these cadres have renounced this goal. And so and we'll get back to this question. But similarly, with respect to the population, estimates, if you look on the web, will go anywhere between 25 million Kurds and up to 40 million Kurds or more, people calling it the biggest stateless nation. But again, it's a people that is spread across different state boundaries, and really not just any state boundaries, at a major fault line with respect to the geopolitics of the Middle East. And so this is one of the reasons why the Kurdish question is so contentious. It's not only what's happening on the ground in any place in Kurdistan, but it's also related to the destabilization of these major states that are fault lines in the ongoing war on terror. Now, so the Kurds themselves then are, again, this is from Wikipedia, they're defined as an ethnic group in the Middle East, mostly inhabiting a contiguous area spanning adjacent parts of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, a geocultural region often referred to as Kurdistan. The Kurds speak the Kurdish languages. It's a variety of Kurdish languages as well, which form a subgroup of the northwestern Iranian branch of Iranian languages. And they are a people people of Indo-European origin and comprise the majority of the population of this region called Kurdistan. However, it's important to note it's not homogeneously Kurdish, this region. So it includes Arabs, Armenians, Assyrians, Azeri, Jewish, Ossetian, Persian, and Turkish communities historically and continuing. So most inhabitants in this region are Muslim, but adherents to other religions are present as well, including, as became quite famous last year, the Yazidis, the Irsan, the Alevis, Christians, and also historically Jews. But most Kurds are Sunni Muslims. So this is an interesting issue, this question of and recent moves by Öcalan to move away from his past sort of militant secularism, so to speak, is also an element at stake. So just basic facts then, just to continue, just to finish off this point about introductory basic facts that are somehow not just basic, but also speak to some of the contention around the subject of this revolution. The Kurds, of course, have never achieved nation-state status. This greater Kurdistan, in some respects, remains an imagined community, even more so than other nations that have a state to them. However, with the emergence of the Kurdish region, the autonomy de facto close to independence of the Kurdish regional government in Iraq on the one hand, and the emergence of this autonomous federal, this autonomous revolutionary zone in Syria, it's emergent territories where Kurdish authorities are in control. Now, Kurds are, and also in Iran, by the way, there is a region which is a province called Kurdistan, which is associated more or less with the space where the Kurdish minority in Iran lives. Now, the Kurds were mostly nomadic people until the end of the First World War and the breakup of the Ottoman Empire. So the story of the Kurds' statelessness is a story that's told, makes sense with respect to the question of the crisis that took place in the region at the end of the Ottoman Empire and the emergence of these new nation states that emerged. So what ends up happening is the Kurds are split amongst these new emergent states. 10% of the population in Syria, 18% of the population in Turkey, more or less, 15 to 20% of the population in Iraq, and nearly 10% of Iran, according again to, this is Wikipedia sources, and any of these kinds of counting questions are going to be contentious. Last basic fact, people have probably heard the term Peshmerga. The Peshmerga are actually, they're the fighting forces associated with the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, and they have been in alliance with the revolutionary forces in Rojava, increasingly coordinated in the last several months. However, there's been tension between them as well, and so we'll talk about that. So just with respect to playing around with the maps to make the points that I already made. So this is what the region looked like back in 1914, and I want to foreground this because we'll come back at the end to talk about what this democratic confederal model promises. And one of the things that it promises, in a sense, is to solve a bunch of problems about ethnicity and religion and minority, majority statuses and the like that are problems associated with the era of the nation state. So the borders in the region, of course, are contested borders, and they're largely the product of the settlements of the First World War, in fact. So where you see the breakup of the Ottoman Empire into the emergence of Syria, Iraq, and obviously Turkey, with respect to at least 3 of the 4 spaces that are imagined as the Greater Kurdistan, these borders come in at the end of the First World War, and so now when we think about again maps and if you look at a Syrian political map. Basically the region of Rojava, which means West Kurdistan, is not recognized according to the Ba'athist regime. In fact, Al-Hasaka province is more or less coming over it. But now if you look alternatively at a linguistic map, of people speaking the different Kurdish languages. You see these different Kurdish languages. Then you see how this greater Kurdistan is imagined, so to speak, composed over top of these other state and crossing over these state borders. Now, so similarly, so if you look on Google Maps, and this is what Kurdistan looks like, and you have, again, Rojava means the west, means West Kurdistan. So if you look inside, sorry, these are a bit spread out, but I wanted so within the revolution in Rojava, there's 3 provinces. There's Jazira, which is on the east. There's Kobane, which is in the center, and then there's Efrin, which is furthest to the west. But this is imagined as the entire region. Of course, it's not a contiguous region, because if you look at, so this is going back to September of 2014, and the place where I was in December is Jazira, which is the one closest to the Iraqi border, and in fact we went in through Iraq. The Iraqi border. Kobane is the site of this much publicized struggle against ISIS, and then you have this other space. And so this is an issue, this situation, this autonomous revolutionary forces and revolutionary situation has emerged in a territory that itself is non-contiguous. So you can't get from Jazira over to Kobane without crossing ISIS territory. Okay, so nevertheless, through Turkey, and there's an embargo with Turkey. So there's all kinds of accusations with respect to the Turkish forces, the Turkish state actually facilitating ISIS fight against Kobane and the like. And this was also part of the international press with respect to coverage over what's going on in Kobane. So this then is the situation in December, I believe, January 15th. So about a month after I was there, and you see by this point, so between so these yellow are basically the YPG, the Kurdish forces. So you see that Kobane had been sieged, basically, had been reduced, and now the situation now is that it's been liberated. So the situation of Kobane has been liberated. Note, you'll see in Jazira itself, there's a couple of places, particularly in Kamishlu, which is the place in the middle where it looks like there's like a red cloud with up top in the northeast. Looks like a red cloud that's raining or something like this. That this is actually there's actually a détente with the Assad forces. There's all sorts of accusations on the part, particularly of Islamist forces, that they're actually in cahoots with the Assad regime because there's a détente. And in fact, so you can see the post office. I'll show you some pictures. The post office, the airport, and even a neighborhood in the town remain loyalist strongholds to the regime. But for the most part, it's under the control of the revolutionary forces. And that's just looking at it looking at it closer. So, and we were in those 10 days I was there. We crossed the border up at this triangle, basically. Went into Derek, spent some time in Kamishlu, Amude, and all the way over to Sarakani, which is the closest we were to fighting. So, as I say, with respect to the press coverage for in the fight for Kobane, the press coverage of the fight for Kobane, the mainstream press coverage was very much about this struggle against the forces of darkness and evil, which are, of course, ISIS. And so and in fact, the role of these women in struggling against ISIS was something that was very much put at the foreground of the mainstream account of what was going on. But like I said, what these people were fighting against was clear, but what they were fighting for was less understood. So let me just give you a basic chronology of the events in Rojava before diving into what I think are description, analytic sort of of analytic treatment of what the main features are, the main distinctive features of this revolutionary form of governance that's emerging in the region against the backdrop of this revolutionary situation and this revolutionary opportunity that the war in Syria and the virtual collapse of state authority, tyrannical state authority, provides for these forces. In fact, this is some of the imagery. This is imagery from the internet that shows a kind of romantic vision that some people have of the situation in Rojava, linking it directly to the anarchist struggle in Spain in the 1930s. And I could talk about that in question and answers, because actually Spain is a country I do know something about. And there's interesting convergences and obvious divergences, in particular with respect to this question of the relationship between nationalism and the revolutionary forces. But you see, in particular, this is a famous picture of a revolutionary militia woman in Barcelona in 1936 with a Kurdish woman fighter, and there you see the Kurdish colors of the Kurdish flag with an old anarchist flag. So the basic chronology of the events, I think, to understand the situation and the hegemonic control exercised by the forces that are linked in some way to the PKK through political and paramilitary organizations, goes back to at least a decade to in Kamishlu, which is that one town I mentioned that is still a divided town. There was a massacre actually after a football game, and this led to a lot of brutal state repression that was then sort of responded to. It was sort of seen as be an awakening that was responded to by these Kurdish forces that were eager to try this new kind of democratic confederal style of political consciousness raising and mobilization of the people that was linked to developing ideas coming straight from Öcalan in prison. So we'll talk about this. So there's a long period of against the Syrian regime and in conditions of repression by the Syrian regime of politicization, consciousness raising that goes out that can be linked back in the case of most of the cadres we talked to 2004 in this Kamishlu massacre. Now 19th July 2012, which is a historic day as well with respect to this Spanish analogy, because this was the day after the Frankist uprising and the outbreak of the revolution in Barcelona, in fact. So July 19th, 2012 is what they call the beginning of the Rojava revolution. And again, we can get back. We could talk about this in question and answers, because it's contended with respect to what extent, because the Assad regime basically withdrew from Rojava and there was very little violence. So it was kind of a pacted withdrawal. And the Kurdish forces then seized control over the areas city by city. And the first to declare freedom was, in fact, Kobane. And that's part of the symbolic resonance of the struggle for Kobane. November 2013, Rojava announces its autonomy. So, and it announces autonomy from the regime, but is very clear that it sees itself as a model which is a third way between, on the one hand, the regime forces of Assad, and on the other hand, the forces of Islamism, which were becoming increasingly, and have become by this point, hegemonic in the rest of Syria. But declaring all the while a commitment and aspiration to be part of a democratic Syria. So it announces autonomy, and in fact in January of 2014 the Geneva II conference is held for the resolution of the Syrian conflict, and the Democratic Union Party, which are these forces which are hegemonic on the ground in Rojava, are excluded from the conference, even though they request a delegation, and in response, and on the same day of the conference, they declare these three autonomous cantons the same day: Jazeera in the east, Kobane in the center, and Afrin in the west. So what are the main features of this revolution as described by the militants themselves, the cadres involved in the implementation of this revolution? I'll just let Muslim Muhammad, who's one of the co-presidents of the PYD, put it in his words with respect to how they legitimate and justify and at least try to sell their revolution, whether or not this is how it actually actually works. It's interesting in its own right, but this is the way that they legitimate it. So he says, we have created in the middle of the civil war in Syria 3 independent cantons in the Rojava region that function by democratic autonomous rule, together with the ethnic and religious minorities of the region, Arabs, Turkmen, Assyrians, Armenians, Christians, Kurds. We have written a collective political structure for these autonomous cantons, our social contract. So it's kind of interesting. I've referred to it in some respects as a kind of revolutionary consociationalism for people who are aware with the literature and political science, trying to talk about how you get accommodation, multicultural, multi-confessional, multi-ethnic accommodation under the rubric of one kind of political authority. They talk about consociational guarantees for minority representation and the like, and this is built into their structure. So it's a revolutionary structure of government, but it's building into ethnic and religious minority accommodation, and also in a way that understands itself kind of like a revolutionary constitution. So referring to a social contract. Linked into this then is they say, we have established a People's Council, including 101 representatives from all cooperatives, committees, and assemblies running each of our cantons. So there's a big emphasis on assembly-style direct democracy. Now, it's interesting because it's assembly-style direct democracy that is being organized against the backdrop of a total war and a mobilization of the people for total war. And it's being mobilized and organized by cadres which have a long political history of paramilitary organization. And so there's a tension between the paramilitary dynamic on the one hand and a radical assembly democracy dynamic, which is addressed by the movement itself. But it's a very interesting combination. And I'll go back to talking about this. And linked into this, what I was calling this revolutionary consociational accommodation is linked into a kind of gender politics as well, a gender representation which is guaranteed by this kind of a quota system, in fact. So we established a model of co-presidency. Each political entity always has both a female and a male president, and a quota of 40% gender representation in order to enforce gender equality throughout all forms of public life and political representation. So this gender dimension, and I'll get back to this, is one of the most interesting elements, dimensions of this, or features of this revolution, and complete with gender quotas and the like. So just to say a little bit more about this model, where it comes from, it comes pretty directly from the writings of Öcalan. The writings of Öcalan since he's been in prison by the Turkish state, and Öcalan himself has been very much influenced by the writings of Murray Bookchin, who's a social ecologist and an interesting figure on the American sort of libertarian socialist left. Of sorts, and so we'll talk about this, and that's where he gets the term confederalism from. But so in Öcalan's word, I'll just read from his book that's been translated now, Democratic Confederalism, some of his writings. The Kurdish liberation movement is working for a system of democratic self-organization in Kurdistan with the features of a confederation. Democratic confederalism understands itself as a coordination model for a democratic nation. It provides a framework within which inter alia minorities, religious communities, cultural groups, gender-specific groups, and other societal groups can organize autonomously. This model may also be called a way of organization for democratic nations and cultures. And I could go on, but this is sort of, it comes very directly from these writings from Öcalan. And there's an interesting issue, and we'll get back to this question, of the cadres are very explicitly committed to this radical assembly style democracy, and there's this sort of paradox, because when you push them on why this is the case, they almost 100% of the time will quote to you, because Abdullah Öcalan says so. As Abdullah Öcalan has argued. So it's an interesting issue, because you have a revolutionary leader who has a clear charismatic appeal, but it's a revolutionary leader who's not on the ground. He's in fact in prison far away, and been in prison since 1998. And the revolutionary leader, the charismatic leader, is saying radical democracy. So it's a kind of interesting thing, how these cadres come to espouse radical democracy and those tensions. And we'll get back to that because there's a lot of food for polemic, I'm sure, in a group of like this with thinking about this. Let me just before moving on, just mention to the strengths of the revolution. I'll get into that this democratic confederal model is something that is strange. It's strange because it's in a sense it comes from these Western writers. And in particular, the influence of Murray Bookchin, who's up in Vermont and thinking about the possibility for municipal governance of a kind of participatory, assembly style kind of very close to kind of the concerns of the Occupy movement. And nevertheless, it gets taken up by this person in a very different situation. And you get this very interesting, it's a very interesting example of a kind of ideological hybridity, so to speak. And we can get back to this. But it's not just one of the things that is most interesting about this model is that there's a deep affinity, I would say, historically between this democratic confederal model and the old Ottoman system of the millet system. It's a democratized millet system, so to speak. So let me just remind those of you who might not be aware, or inform those who might not be aware of the millet system in the Ottoman period, which if you look at not only Öcalan's writings, but even the way I set it up, so much of the problem of the Kurdish people is linked into the era of the nation state, and what came before it was this Ottoman Empire, which was obviously not structured democratically, but it was in some respects confederal. So according to Kemal Karpat, who wrote a very interesting article called Millets and Nationality, The Roots of the Incongruity of Nation State in the Post-Ottoman Era, he says, the constitutional basis of the Ottoman millet system was the Muslim concept which recognized the non-Muslim monotheistic believers as the peoples of the book and accorded them protection as jimis. I don't know the term, but how you pronounce the term. But jimis is although the Ottoman millets remained theoretically within the legal framework of the jimi concept, in practice their status was determined by the prevailing linguistic and ethnic conditions in the Balkans, as well as by other Islamic principles which gave tacit recognition to linguistic and ethnic differences. Indeed, Islam gave tacit recognition to tribal, ethnic, and national groupings, provided that these conform to the principles of family law and recognize the supremacy of the Ummah. So this is an interesting issue. There's a long history of, and in fact, there's a story can be made of the emergence of the Kurdish people and the sense of Kurdish peoplehood linked into that old millet system. So it's an interesting issue as well because when we think, and just to forward some of the discussion I'm sure we'll have, who they're fighting against these people, ISIS in part, or at least mostly fighting against ISIS, who is claiming an Islamic legitimation, but there's actually a deep Islamic history dealing with these sorts of ethnic and linguistic accommodation, that in fact it's been the period of the nation state and the Arab nationalism, the Turkish nationalism, and the Persian nationalism that have in many respects caused all sorts of problems that, for whatever the problems were in the Ottoman system, it was actually pretty good with dealing with ethnic and linguistic diversity. So a last point with respect to the deep history. So there's a deep history with respect to the affinity between Öcalan's model and the millet system. There's also the more direct influence of Murray Bookchin's writings on confederalism. So let me just quote Bookchin on this, and you'll see how the ideology goes through Bookchin to Öcalan's writings, to the cadres who read all of Öcalan's writings and treat it almost as scripture, and it sort of becomes the constitutionalized set of institutions. So what then is confederalism, according to Bookchin? He says, it is above all a network of administrative councils whose members or delegates are elected from popular face-to-face democratic assemblies in the various villages, towns, and even neighborhoods of large cities. The members of these confederal councils are strictly mandated, recallable, and responsible to the assemblies that choose them for the purpose of coordinating and administering the policies formulated by the assemblies themselves. Their function is thus a purely administrative and practical one, not a policy-making one like the function of representatives in the Republican systems of government. And so this sort of critique of the representative model and an alternative participatory model, something that a lot of you, because I'm sure, are familiar with in various guises, and this is the guise that it takes in terms of at least the ideological justification and presentation of the revolution. Now, so let me just talk about things that I saw on the ground that I think are clear strengths, and I'll just bullet point them for you, and then I will also bullet point for you what I think are the main challenges and vulnerabilities of the revolution, and I'll get through as much as I can in this hour here, and then other points that I don't get to, you feel free to ask me for questions and answers. So bullet point size with respect to the strengths of the revolution. In the first instance, the discipline, the revolutionary discipline, and the commitment, collective mobilization, and politicization of the citizenry at large. So you saw a massive amount of political engagement and commitment in what has seemed to be an existential struggle for survival against. I mean, in many of these places, we're 20 kilometers away from ISIS. You could even hear some of the fighting on the horizon, and the discipline and the bravery and the commitment that these people showed. I think it's something that really explains some of the force on the ground. It doesn't explain everything with respect to the defense of Kobane, and obviously the alliance with the NATO forces and the bombings are an important part of the story of the defense of Kobane, and not one that the cadres themselves feel very comfortable talking about. But nevertheless, at the same time, it is true and seems apparent that as compared to what Patrick Coburn, I think, very plausibly describes about what happened in Iraq when ISIS pushed forward so impressively in a certain respect in August, and there was a 1 million-man army of the Iraqi army that basically disintegrated. Up against people talking about 6,000 ISIS forces or the like. This kind of running away is not something that you're likely to see amongst these revolutionary cadres, who are equally committed to an ideological program that is similar to the jihadis, who have a very firm conviction in their ideological program. With the great difference that their ideological program is actually seems like a good one. In terms of they're talking about radical democracy, gender emancipation, ethnic, linguistic, religious accommodation, and toleration. This seems good. Okay, so it's discipline, revolutionary commitment, collective mobilization, and politicization in the pursuit of something that, at least on the surface, has a lot of admirable ideological dimensions to it. And clearly, if we look at what's on offer in the region, the different political projects in the region, it seems to be the most attractive one. Being advanced by militants. And central to it is this insistence upon gender emancipation, as well as the attempts to accommodate ethnic and religious diversity. So I think those are the major strengths of the revolution. With respect to the challenges and vulnerabilities of the revolution, I think there are many, and we can and we'll, I'm sure, have much to discuss. But let me just again bullet point them. A first on the ground issue has to do with the integration of the local Arab population in Rojava itself, which is about 10% of the population in Rojava. And there's reasons to be concerned about their ability to actually pull off this multi-ethnic accommodation in the context of this war, and the kinds of suspicions that come up against the Arab population on the one hand, of both remaining loyal to the Assad regime, but also, if not loyal to the Assad regime, to the jihadi forces. Second, the coordination and alliances with groups outside of the three cantons, I think, is a really crucial question because of the extent to which the revolution and the revolutionary developments on the ground are not to be overstated. Insofar as you certainly have impressive attempts to change power relations, to change property relations and the like, to democratize life in many respects, but but against the backdrop of a brutal embargo and a subsistence economy and barely surviving, okay? Barely surviving and doing what they can to barely subsistence war conditions. And in order for this revolutionary model to be something that is above just mere survival, it's going to need to spread, and particularly spread to the rest of the Arab population, to the Arab population in the rest of Syria. And this is a really crucial question, and their ability to do that, I think, is questionable at best. So, third point, which is related to this, is a challenge to avoid nationalist excesses and exclusion of minorities in the educational system in particular. This is linked into questions of overcoming the national imaginary, the nationalist imaginary, and linked into this question of the ability for the revolution to spread. Because to the extent that the revolution is, despite Öcalan's, and we'll come back to this, and the revolutionaries themselves turning away from the aspiration, renouncing explicitly the aspiration of the greater Kurdistan, to the extent that the imaginary still remains the symbols of the great Kurdish movement and the great Kurdish leader and the like, this is something that is very difficult to sell to people who don't identify with the Kurdish cause, which may be a minority in Rojava, but there's certainly a majority in the region. So this is, and to the extent that following Öcalan himself, the problems in any one place in the region can't be resolved without there being a regional level resolution. This is a big issue for the revolution. A link to this is something I've already touched upon, which is navigation between the tensions between charismatic leadership. Not only charismatic leadership, but also the logic of military cadres in a time of war, on the one hand, and this radical assembly will of the people, direct democracy on the other. And finally, and I've already again touched on it, and we'll come back to it, I'm sure, in the questions and answers, this issue of the urgent necessity to avoid playing into the divide and conquer tactics of both the sub-imperialist but also obviously the imperialist powers proper. So that's an overview of what the main issues are. Let me just go into some of the strengths. Spend a little bit more time talking about some of the strengths. With respect, the first is this point about revolutionary discipline, politicization, and collective mobilization. Let me give the word back to Muslim Muhammad. He says, everyone knows, it's a nice reflection with respect to, we just had elections in this country, so everyone knows how capitalist democracy plays for the votes. It is a play of elections. In many places, parliamentary elections are just about propaganda, only addressing the direct self-interest of the voter. Democratic autonomy is about the long term. It is about people understanding and exercising their rights, to get society to become politicized. That is the core of building democratic autonomy. In Europe, you will find a society that is not politicized. Political parties are only about persuasion and individual benefits, not about actual emancipation and politicization. Real democracy is based on a politicized society. If you now go to Kobane, and he was saying this back in November when the fighting was still on, and you meet the fighters, and still on, but when Kobane was still under siege, and you meet the fighters of the YPG and the YPJ, you will find that they know exactly why they are fighting and what they are fighting for. They are not there for money or interests. They are there for elementary values which they practice at the same time. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. I want to emphasize this point because this is a point that resonates with a long tradition of revolutionary thought and radical democratic thought, going back to at least having its roots in Rousseau, and what Rousseau has to say in The Social Contract. Let me just quote Rousseau on this because I think the resonance is clear. Rousseau in Book 3, Chapter 15, on deputies or representatives, what he says, as soon as public service ceases to be the chief business of the citizens, and they would rather serve with their money than with their persons, the state is not far from its fall. When it is necessary to march out to war, they pay troops and stay at home. When it is necessary to meet in council, they name deputies and stay at home. By reason of idleness and money, they end up by having soldiers to enslave their country and representatives to sell it. Okay. so anyhow, there's a Rousseauian motif there, which also later gets picked up, I think, by Karl Marx in the early Marx in particular, on the Jewish question, his critique of mere political emancipation and thinking about this kind of bifurcated, alienated consciousness of people in political society of Germany of his day. So here's what Marx has to say, and I think again resonates with this idea. There is no difference between what they do and what they represent. Where the political state, says Marx and on the Jewish question, where the political state has attained its true development, man, not only in thought, in consciousness, but in reality and life, leads a twofold life, a heavenly and an earthly life. Life in the political community, in which he considers himself a communal being, and life in civil society, in which he acts as a private individual, regards other men as a means, degrades himself into a means, and becomes the plaything of alien powers. Okay, so there's something about this fusion between what they do and what they represent, linked into a deep aspiration for a radical participatory understanding of democracy. And in fact, the revolutionaries themselves use this language of radical democracy, which they link into a notion of revolutionary self-defense. And I want to say something about that. But let me just quote Muslim Muhammad for one last time. He says, "We are engaged in the construction of radical democracy, to mobilize people to organize themselves and to defend themselves by means of people's armies like the People's Defense Unit and Women's Defense Unit. We are practicing this model of self-rule and self-organization without the state as we speak." So the People's Defense Unit is the YPG, and then the particular women's militias are the YPJ, who I did get a chance to see some of these battalions. So other people will speak of self-rule in theory, but for us, this search for self-rule is our daily revolution. Women, man, all strands of our society are now organized. The reason why Kobane still stands is because we have built these structures. So these structures, which are understood to be radical, participatory, democratic structures, linked into a revolution of consciousness, which I'll get back to. But it's also a revolution that understands itself as clearly against a revolution against the statist mentality. Okay, so this is just to conclude with Muslim Muhammad, one last quote from him. He says, "We have in essence developed a democracy without the state. That is a unique alternative in a region plagued by the internally conflicted Free Syrian Army, the Assad regime, and the self-proclaimed Islamic State." Now, along those lines, Dr. Hussein Koser, who was a YPG commander at the military headquarters in Serikani, who we got to interview, he said something. He said, "We don't operate as a state and don't aim to, but our mobilization is stronger than 10 states. We are not aiming at a statist mentality, but rather to organize the people. The people can be without the state, though the state cannot be without the people." So here again, this resonates with a long-standing critique of the state, but it also, as citizens of a very powerful nation states and the role of the modern state in everyday life, this cuts against very much the mainstream understanding of the state being the guarantor of the peace and social order on the one hand, and also a compulsory association with a territorial basis. So there's a sense in which what they're doing is understanding a radical democracy that is a logic that is different from a state logic. Okay, so outside of the Weberian understanding of what the state is, and also outside of a Hobbesian conception that if you have a breakdown of the social order and the onset of a time of war, that in that time of war, as Hobbes would put it in the Leviathan, chapter 13, he says, in that time of war, no instruments of moving and removing such things as require much force, no knowledge of the face of earth, no account of time, no arts, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Right? So there's some elements that are undeniable undeniable in this war situation in Rojava and in Syria generally, where there's been lots of human suffering. I don't know, I've seen figures around 300,000 people dead in the Syrian conflict, tons of refugees in the Syrian conflict. But at the same time, it is true that against this Hobbesian nightmare, so to speak, you see this radical revolutionary rupture and a revolutionary instance and a revolutionary opportunity. And one that, in particular, one of the interesting things is that there's this emphasis in the revolution, amongst the revolutionary forces, in education and consciousness raising. They're setting up academies, doing all kinds of educational pedagogy, revolutionary educational pedagogy. So it's not a time of no letters or no society, so to speak, even though in many respects there's a lot of there's definitely fear among some people, but not these cadres necessarily, and there's a lot of violent death going around. So this gets to this issue of understanding the revolutionary situation. 10 minutes, okay, perfect. The revolutionary situation, what we know about revolutions, and what now, and something that Marx himself was famously has been accused, at least, of ignoring, is the importance of a crisis of the state, in fact, in creating an opportunity for a revolutionary rupture. So just to go to, for example, Theda Skocpol's important work on revolution, states and social revolutions, she points out that there must be a crisis of a state, often provoked by international factors, such as increasing economic or security competition from abroad. It is a crisis, not merely a challenge, because this is a challenge that the state cannot meet given its current institutional constraints. As a result, elites and the army become divided over what to do, and loyalty to the regime weakens. This crisis of the state creates the revolutionary situation. So she's speaking in a kind of general theory of revolutions, and certainly there's a crisis of the state that helps explain the emergence of this revolutionary opportunity. So that said, let me now just say one more point about the resonance between this democratic and federal model that emerges, flowers, so to speak, out of this revolutionary situation and this crisis of the state. And there's another affinity with what Marx described in the 1870s, in 1870 in Paris, particularly the Paris Commune. So when Marx says, when he describes the Commune, there's something that is very similar in his description of the Commune to the way in which these people describe and try to justify the revolutionary form of radical democratic governments. He says, the Commune was to be the political form of even the smallest country hamlet, and that in the rural districts the standing army was to be replaced by a national militia with an extremely short term of service. The rural communities of every district were to administer their common affairs by an assembly of delegates in the central town, and these district assemblies were again to send deputies to the national delegation in Paris, each delegate to be at any time revocable and bound by the mandat imperatif, formal instructions of his constituents. And then he goes on to say, the unity of the nation was not to be broken, but on the contrary to be organized by communal constitution and to become a reality by the destruction of the state power, which claimed to be the embodiment of that unity, independent of and superior to the nation itself, from which it was but a parasitic excrescence, he says. So there's something about this form that recalls the kind of this emergent radical revolutionary form of governance. Now, let me just say a few more things about this consciousness raising, and I think this is a really interesting element of insisting upon the politicization, this revolutionary politicization of the people as being part of the success of this revolution. So this is in the words of Alder Zelil, who's a member of the coordinating committee of Tevdem, which is a sort of umbrella organization associated with the revolutionary forces in control in Rojava. He says, one of the main reasons for our success has been the mobilization of a societal revolution. Many believed that when the regime fell, democracy would automatically emerge, but we didn't. A democratic system is not just a matter of laws and constitutions. A democratic system is a way of life. We do not believe it is just about changing a leader, but about creating a mentality in society, a revolution for society. It is not just about changing leaders. And then he goes on to say, wherever we go, we don't go there to make them be us. We want to secure that they can be themselves. We try to make them own their own political will. through discussions raising political consciousness. Many have joined the YPJ. We are constantly engaged in the struggle to change mentalities. So there's this struggle that they mentioned, that this revolutionary struggle is part of this kind of consciousness-raising effort. And this again has great resonance with the revolutionary tradition. Going back to, and let me cite, because of the polemical nature perhaps, Che Guevara, what Che Guevara had to say about consciousness-raising, and be thinking about this issue, because a lot of these people who are doing this revolutionary pedagogy are themselves paramilitary forces and the people in arms as well, linked into the people in arms. So what Guevara says back in 1965, he says the sermons of the past have been transposed to the present in the individual consciousness, and a continual labor is necessary to eradicate them. The process is two-sided. On the one side, society acts through direct and indirect education. On the other, the individual subjects himself to a process of conscious self-education. The new society being formed has to compete fiercely with the past. The latter makes itself felt in the consciousness in which the residue of an education systematically oriented towards isolating the individual still weighs heavily. So this idea that the past weighs heavily, and the past of oppression, the past regimes need to be the people need to be uneducated, re-educated, this idea. And this is not only an idea that can be linked back to the guerrilla tactics of someone like Che Guevara, but also to bring it back to Murray Bookchin again in his discussion on confederalism. He says, confederalism is thus the ensemble of decentralization, localism, self-sufficiency, interdependence, and more. This more is the indispensable moral education and character building, what the Greeks called paideia, that makes for rational active citizenship in a participatory democracy, unlike the passive constituents and consumers that we have today. In the end, there is no substitute for a conscious reconstruction of our relationship to each other and to the world. Okay, so it links into Bookchin, but I think it actually is more relevant, the quote by Guevara, because Guevara is obviously someone who fought and ultimately died in what he understood to be revolutionary struggle, and there's something about political education linked into this life and death struggle that's going on, that is explaining the success of this consciousness raising effort. I could quote Fanon, who has interesting things to say on political education, but I'll come back to that, except for what he has to say about the link to violence, okay? Because I think this is an interesting question, and it brings up the last theme that I want to get to, which is this question to go back to this gender question before concluding. So what Fanon says, of course, he says, the mobilization of the masses, when it rises out of a war of liberation, introduces into each man's consciousness the ideas of a common cause, of a national destiny, and of a collective history. At the level of individuals, violence is a cleansing force, he says. It frees the native from his inferiority complex and from his despair and inaction. It makes him fearless and restores his self-respect. Okay? And so there's something about this self-defense linked into this emergence of revolutionary consciousness. Now, let me then just say, however, this role of violence is, of course, a complicated, complex one from a standpoint of moral and political judgment, particularly when we think about places in the world and organizations that are committed to this revolutionary change that aren't born out of nothing, but in fact have conflictual, in many respects, violent pasts. So the PKK as an organization is something that is an organization that has a lot of blood on its hands. From the 1980s forward, and so a lot of these cadres are converted to the new democratic confederal model. But when they talk about this democratic confederal model at the same time that they're waging this war, this is not the first time that there's blood on the hands of these kinds of cadres. Just to remind people about some of the more contentious parts, this is an account by Marcus called "Blood and Belief: The PKK and the Kurdish Fight for Independence." According to Marcus, he says, as the PKK, so we go back to before Öcalan's conversion to democratic confederalism and his conversion to a peace process in Turkey as well. He says, as the PKK fought to establish itself inside Turkey, Öcalan continued to fight against real and potential critics inside the organization. To Öcalan, dissent was a danger to his authority and control over the PKK. Many PKK members simply viewed dissenters as a danger to the group's plans. The thinking inside the PKK was that we were doing something holy, sacred. In that atmosphere, how could someone go and criticize you? Explained a former PKK member. Öcalan may have been the driving force behind these murders, but many in the PKK agreed with what he was doing. Öcalan laid out the path, and the rest of us followed. This unforgiving view towards dissent helped the PKK avoid the ideological splits that fatally weakened other Kurdish organizations. But it also strengthened the already dictatorial powers of Öcalan and quickly became a tool he and senior PKK militants freely used to dispose of those who displeased them, who seemed untrustworthy, or who simply were a burden on the battlefield. So this is talking about a deep past, and again, I'm not an expert on the Kurdish on the Kurdish movement. And so I don't know to what extent this is an objective account. But I think that any of us who are committed to sort of emancipatory politics have to take these kinds of accusations very seriously, and so understand that the PKK is an organization that has this kind of path. Let me just say that Öcalan himself has since his incarceration has done much to critique himself and the PKK in the past. So with respect to the issue of violence in the PKK in general, one of the things he said, which is very interesting, he says, this is in War and Peace in Kurdistan, which came out in 2007. He says the PKK had been conceived as a party with a state-like hierarchical structure, similar to other parties. Such a structure, however, causes a dialectic contradiction to the principles of democracy, freedom, and equality, a contradiction in principle concerning all parties whatsoever their philosophy. Although the PKK stood for freedom-oriented views, we had not been able to free ourselves from thinking in hierarchical structures, he says. And then he goes on to talk about the glorification of war and violence. And he says, because this is an interesting issue, because at the same time that this revolution is taking place in Rojava, which is obviously an armed struggle, Öcalan is pushing for a peace process in Turkey, right? And so so this has led him to elaborate this self-criticism. He says, another main contradiction was the value of war in the ideological and political considerations of the PKK. War was understood as the continuation of politics by different means and romanticized as a strategic instrument. This was a blatant contradiction to our self-perception as a movement struggling for the liberation of society. According to this, the use of armed force can only be justified for the purpose of necessary self-defense. The PKK believed that the armed struggle would be sufficient for winning the rights that the Kurds had been denied. Such a deterministic idea of war is neither socialist nor democratic, although the PKK saw itself as a democratic party. So he gets into a high level of self-critique, at least explicitly. And again, it's an interesting issue because, again, this is a leader who is not on the ground controlling the forces on a day-to-day basis, but in fact imprisoned. And so there's an interesting element of self-critique, reflexivity that may or may not be part of prison as a sort of space for intellectual freedom, perhaps. That said, it is clear that he continues to exercise a charismatic appeal over the cadres, and an appeal that is in some tension, significant tension, with the arguments that what they're trying to do is build a culture of radical democracy in which having anyone be a fountain of ultimate knowledge and authority is somehow problematic. So let me just mention, move to talk about this question of building a culture of radical democracy, and end on saying a few things about gender and how gender is linked into this, and open up and to leave, I guess, for questions and answers more some of the more thorny questions of geopolitics and the like. So with respect to the building a culture of radical democracy, this again is Zelil, the member of the coordinating committee of Tevdem. He says, our approach is not a top-down approach, but about mobilizing society. It is not about giving orders, but about facilitating mobilization. The regime has implemented a top-down mentality. Rather than do what the regime has done, we try to strengthen the people's power, to encourage the people to discuss and implement what they decide. The aim is a culture of democracy. And then speaking to the YPJ commander, she says, just like the rest, and this is an interesting point, just like in the rest of the Rojava system, those at the bottom have the right, the possibility to revoke the positions of their commanders. What applies across all the structures of the Rojava system also applies to the military structures. So this is a claim made by one of the commanders herself about this question of the link between her appeal, her authority as commander, and those of the people who are serving underneath her. Now, with respect to this question of the pedagogy, let me just go back to this question of revolutionary pedagogy one last time to think about the relationship between struggle and this consciousness raising. To go back this time to Paulo Freire, whose Pedagogy of the Press, he says, the oppressed who have been shaped by the death-affirming climate of oppression must find through their struggle the way to life-affirming humanization, and this does not lie simply in having more to eat, although it does involve and cannot fail to include having more to eat. The oppressed have been destroyed precisely because their situation has reduced them to things. In order to regain their humanity, they must cease to be things and fight as men, he says. Okay? Now, he says fight as men, but let me point out that one of the crucial and most interesting issues about this consciousness-raising project is that it's the women at the forefront. Again and again, the cadres were talking about the crucialness of the women being at the forefront, and this is, I think, one of the most fascinating elements of the revolution. So again, the words of one of the cadres who we spoke to, Rukan Ahmed, who was a coordination member for a group called Yekite Star, who spoke to us in Amude. She said, without women's determination, there cannot be determination in our society. That's why we have always emphasized the education of women. Before the revolution, we were organizing education in small groups of 5 to 10 in people's houses. Women had been deemed unimportant, not of equal value. She had been excluded and discriminated against, and that's why no one was paying attention to her. We had to insist on education so that women can understand the need for organizing, so that women can dare and be self-confident. It is important for individuals to be politically conscious and mobilized, because if they lack consciousness and are not mobilized, it is very difficult for them to become political agents. And this then is particularly with respect to the role of the women in the self-defense. Let me just end with a couple of points of food for thought with respect to this gender emancipation goal. One is that the story of these women self-defense militias is something that clearly has an appeal in the West. It was captured in the story about Kobane. And it's speaking to a kind of aspiration for radical equality that someone like again Rousseau mentioned in his famous tract The Emile on the question of education. In fact, he quotes towards the beginning a story about a Spartan woman. He says, a Spartan woman had 5 sons in the army and was awaiting news of the battle. A helot arrives, trembling. She asks him for news. Your 5 sons were killed. Base slave, did I ask you that? We won the victory. The mother runs to the temple and gives thanks to the gods. This is the female citizen. And so there's something about this appeal to participation in political life, but also in particular participation in self-defense and military self-defense, which is that's what the gender emancipation project is all about. And in fact, for those of us educated in the advanced capitalist countries, the Western countries, the rich countries, one of the details about these women revolutionary fighters, which is most in some respects interesting and paradoxical, is is that their struggle for gender emancipation has very little to do with a struggle, an explicit struggle at least, for sexual emancipation. And in fact, the revolutionary cadres take an oath of celibacy. So it's a kind of and we pushed Ahmad, who was a particularly cultured and articulate advocate of the revolution, Yekete Star coordination member. We pushed her on this question about what about the question of the Western woman and the Western woman with freedoms with respect to the labor markets and the like, but in particular with respect to sexual freedoms and the like. She says, we do not consider Western women to be liberated. In the Middle East, the dominant perception is that the Western women are liberated. While it is true that individual freedoms and certain rights have been gained, we cannot conclude societal freedom from this. It doesn't mean a lot to speak of individual freedoms when the whole of society is enslaved. If the whole of society is enslaved, how can I be free? Individual freedom is connected to societal freedom. In some way, women in the Middle East have more opportunity to seek freedom because we are closer to natural life, she says. And in fact, pushed on this question in particular of the celibacy oath and sexual relations, why the celibacy oath amongst the women cadres, Nazan Ustendag in Hamburg in April, she responded to my question. She said, as long as freedom is not achieved, sexual relations will reflect and reinforce patriarchal relations of domination, which is actually resonates with one strand at least of radical feminism in the West. But in ways that are clearly in tension with dominant, hegemonic, kind of liberal feminisms. And so how is this, so just on this last point, and I'll end on this last point, how is this gender emancipation articulated and conceived as part of the struggle for human emancipation? Öcalan himself has written eloquently on this, saying women's slavery is the most profound and disguised social area where all types of slavery, oppression, and colonization are realized. And Ahmed, again, she says, the problems of society and family problems are connected. Many times, men carry their problems home and vent them in the form of violence against women. So there's this notion of, in fact, Öcalan talks about women as the original colony, as the original proletariat. And let me give the last word to Sazda Avagin, who was another YPJ, the YPJ commander for the platoon in Amude that we mentioned. She says, we are not just women struggling against ISIS. We are also struggling to change mentalities and to show the power of women to the outside world. We also want to be a voice in the search for the emancipation of women. We want to be a voice in the historical struggle of women for freedom. We also want to build a philosophy of life. We don't want the world to know us because of our weapons, but because of our ideas. Our struggle goes beyond Rojava. Our struggle is on a global scale. Those who come to visit us also see that we are struggling to create networks with other women. We want people to know us with our emotions, ideas, colors. War is something we engage in out of necessity, but not because we like war. At the center of our struggle, she goes on to say, is Öcalan, which is not without its irony, and women martyrs such as Seyit Payman. They have been on the same road as Öcalan in the struggle. With their self-sacrificing spirit and philosophy, we want to struggle in the same way. So I think with that, we've covered a lot of ground, and I have a bunch of pictures from my trip, which I didn't really get to, but I can show you some of them in questions and answers, I'm sure. Okay, thank you.